We've named this episode after the hunt for the Red October, because it's kind of like that, but instead of a Soviet submarine, the search is on for a powerful sleeper agent known to the US government only as Dorothy. The year is 1981, and her network of associates has infiltrated the US military to the extent that the Department of Defense has concerns over national security, both at home and abroad. In simpler terms, this episode is about an attempt to uncover and exonerate the presence of homosexuality in the American Armed Forces. Imagine that conversation on repeat a few hundred times with a few hundred sailors, and you'll get some sense of how the NIS spent the summer of 1981, banging their heads against the wall and pouring a giant vat of taxpayers' money right down the drain. The NIS, the Naval Investigative Service, is the predecessor to the NCIS, the one with 4 different TV series, the original, and then spin-offs set in Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Hawaii. If you know those shows, you need to understand that this is not yours, but your dad's NCIS, to reverse the common idiom. These were not the free-willing, wisecracking investigators that you've come to know and love. Think something closer to the stereotype of the Cold War G-men, agents in gray suits, dark glasses, of social justice and morality rooted firmly in the 1950s and 60s. Throughout those decades, multiple public service announcements were released warning Americans that the potential presence of gay men in public parks and restrooms. In the decades leading up to the Dorothy investigation, the U.S. military was still systematically purging its forces of openly homosexual members. Same-sex attraction was considered not only immoral, but also a threat to the stability of any fighting force. But in spite of any targeted attempt to make our armies exclusively heterosexual, gay members remained, because, of course they did. It wasn't safe to be out in American society, so few of them willingly exposed themselves to public scorn. Over the course of 1981, 1,976 enlisted gay men have been identified and discharged from the military during a nationwide crackdown. According to the book, Conduct Unbecoming Gays and Lesbians in the U.S. Military, this marked a new record for gay-related discharges in the post-Vietnam era, and it meant a succession of purges from bases around the world. Since virtually all the sailors and soldiers caught up in the military's vast dragnet waived their rights and quietly left the service, few outside of the affected bases were even aware that the investigations were even going on. People simply disappeared. As it turns out, not even the Defense Department knew what was going on, as evidenced by their grasping and confused interrogations. At the center of this witch hunt was the shadowy presence of Dorothy herself. Her name had surfaced again and again as NIS agents were undercover in gay clubs and gatherings. The more they heard it, the more agents realized the terrifying authority in this name. As far as they could tell, the friendship of Dorothy meant everything in the gay community. At the mere mention of her name, all doors would open, all courtesies would extend. To be a friend of Dorothy was to have a free pass to every corner of this otherwise weary group. Acceptance was immediate and total. Nobody wanted to cross Dorothy, so a friend of hers better be a friend of yours, as far as the agents could tell. The NIS was convinced that if only they could find this woman, she would give them the names of her entire network of associates. So, this scene too, or some version of it, played out repeatedly in NIS investigation rooms. Dorothy was, as far as the NIS could tell, a cultural terror figure, leading sleeper cells in a vast underground network she had somehow constructed right under their noses. And with her tentacles so deep in the armed forces, all 5 branches, who could know what she might do next? But before I say more about Dorothy, I want to go back a little further in time, past the 80s, into the 1940s, to the release of the film The Wizard of Oz. Opening in theaters in 1939, Oz had a lukewarm reaction. It banked only $3 million on a $2.8 million budget, not including promotional costs. It was the most expensive movie ever made, and likely lost money. But 17 years later, in 1956, it aired for the first time on television, on CBS. People loved it. 3 years later, CBS committed to airing The Wizard of Oz each December, and it became an annual family tradition for much of the United States. The popularity of the film led its star, Judy Garland, to continue performing its soundtrack to live audiences into the late 60s. As much as mainstream America fell in love with The Wizard of Oz, the film resonated in a special way with one marginalized group. A journalist from Time magazine, covering one of these shows, noted, "A disproportionate part of Garland's nightly followers seem to be homosexual. The boys in the tight trousers roll their eyes, tear at their hair, and practically levitate from their seats." And of course, idioms are entirely contextual, and the meanings of words adapt over time. But the way these exchanges were heard by many is beyond dispute, and if you have any lingering doubts as to the depth of the connection between this film and the LGBT+ community, ask yourself this. What's the most easily recognizable symbol for this community? You probably know it from the community flag, the rainbow. And what's that iconic song from The Wizard of Oz that all of us know, even if we haven't seen the movie? That's right, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. The themes of this simple song, of wanting things from life that others already have access to, and of dreaming of faraway places where you can be the person you feel yourself to be. You can do the things you desire in your heart to do, have an obvious resonance with LGBT+. When that film was released, and then beamed into tens of millions of homes each year on television, there was little room in our society for gay men to live freely, or to have things in life, like marriages and children, that heterosexual people often had. All of which brings us back to the NIS in 1989. The figure of Dorothy Gale from this iconic movie had long since become an icon in the gay community, and her name had become a password among gay men that allowed them to identify one another without outing themselves publicly. They wouldn't say they were gay, they would say they were, quote, a friend of Dorothy, as Scarecrow had said of himself in the film, and other members of their community would know what they meant. It was very similar to the way members of Alcoholics Anonymous will sometimes introduce themselves as, quote, friends of Bill W., Bill W. being short for Bill Wilson, one of the founders of that organization. But for anyone unfamiliar with this coded language, it would go right over their heads. They would just nod vacantly or shrug, or they would launch an investigation/witch hunt as happened 40 years ago. But because this whole thing was such an embarrassing debacle, we know less about the investigation itself than we should. The government is not in the habit of publicizing its biggest fails, and like most things surrounding the dismissal of nearly 2,000 enlisted men in 1981, it just melted quietly away like the soldiers and sailors themselves. Fortunately, the world is in a different place today, and it will continue to evolve. Significant advances have taken place in acceptance and equal rights throughout our society, and many of the dreams of gay men from the 1960s and 80s have been realized, but they'll always be friends of Dorothy. And there are still many communities and homes where this is not so. The full scope of LGBT+ acceptance is still unfolding around us, and for those especially oppressed in these situations, there is still the dream of a faraway reality in which they might live and be loved for who they are.